Show, and I'm excited to welcome New York Times bestselling author Joanna Ho. How are you doing? And we're going to talk about your latest book, We Who Produce Pearls, an anthem for Asian America. How are you, Joanna?
Well, I'm great. Thanks for having me on today.
Talk about why you wanted to become an author. What was the whole motivation for you?
Sure. So my background is in education. I was a teacher and a vice principal. I've always been very passionate about inclusivity and equity. And so when I had children, I was looking for books for my kids. I used to also teach English.
Okay.
And that's when I started to realize actually that there is such a dearth of representation and inclusion, not only of Asian kids in children's literature, but all kids of color in general. So I think at a very high level, I have a very strong desire for my own kids, but for all kids to be able to see themselves and to see others in stories. And so felt really inspired to try to write my own, to add just one more voice to what has become like a rising wave of authors and storytellers telling stories that we never got to see when we were children.
How do you think you became that New York Times bestselling author? It didn't happen overnight, right? Or maybe you have an overnight story.
No, I wish I did, but I'm very grateful for the journey. I wrote and wrote and wrote. I was very fortunate after a few years to sign with a wonderful agent, and then it took me almost 2 years but to sell. It took us to almost 2 years to sell my first story,
Wow.
and that story was became like an instant New York Times bestseller. And I just think that it is blood, sweat, tears. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of rejection. And then ultimately, there's so much that was out of my hands. It's readers, it's teachers, it's booksellers really taking stories and sharing them, outside of what the machine of industry is doing.
Isn't it crazy that so many people might have rejected you and then
Yeah.
look at you now?
Yeah, I know. I sometimes I go back and I look at the rejection letters and it's hard to imagine that this is what I'd be doing now.
Well, the most successful people, and again, you're part of a special club, New York Times. And there is that special club, and then your success as a published author. A lot of people don't want to take that rejection. They don't want to go through that stuff. They give up, or they say, okay, I'm just going to just do this. And you just kept
Yeah,
grinding. And that's very important. And I agree about the misrepresentation of children's books. And hey, is this somebody that's me?
right.
I taught, I was a former teacher myself. I don't know if you knew my background, and I taught X amount of years before I went back into, I guess, the business world as an entrepreneur, pro wrestler turned teacher, turned entrepreneur, turned maybe back to pro wrestling again, but
Yeah.
also still the entrepreneur. But in that journey, they just they're dying for education. People of color are dying to to be represented right. They're dying to get the best education possible because they know education's their only way out.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why that we don't have those. I mean, it's got to be people like you to go out there and say, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, they think there's a lot of people who are collectively lifting our voices in different ways to fight for not just like representation and inclusivity, but just to have a greater voice in shifting the systems and the ways that we do things.
The story, the narrative, all those different things.
Yeah.
So, which book was the one that made you a New York Times bestselling author? Then we'll get to your latest book.
The first one was Eyes That Kiss in the Corners. That was the first one that was published. And then the companion to that book, Eyes That Speak to the Stars, was also a New York Times bestseller. So I feel very grateful to readers and to those who picked up the book and to share it and have shared it with others.
Well, your book is beautiful, the current one.
Thank you.
The illustrations, uh, you know, unbelievable. And again, in a story about Asian America. How much research did you put into writing this book?
I researched for over a year before I even sat down to start writing it. And, part of the reason for that is because we don't learn anything about very, very, very little about Asians
No.
in America, Asians in our ancestral homelands. Like maybe people can say like Chinese exclusion or Japanese internment, but other than that, it's almost nothing for the majority of us. And so I had to sort of make up some of so much of that knowledge. So I did so much research between like interviews, between reading like a billion books and watching documentaries. And this was also in the pandemic, so nobody was traveling, no one was going anywhere. So a lot was just whatever I could do at home. And then from there is where the book really, the idea and was born.
No, and you think about this, and you think about specifically enough why there's not enough in the history books. There's
Yeah.
like a paragraph, right? You're especially
Yeah.
fourth graders, third graders reading it, and you had to look in the eyes of how you could explain this to children. That's the
Yeah.
exciting part, right?
Yeah.
Of being able to talk about Asian Americans, right?
Yeah, very much so. So taking all that research and then, it's like pages and pages and pages and trying to figure out how to turn all of that research, some of it, a lot of it, which is quite painful history, a lot of it, which is really empowering and inspiring, but how do you turn that into a book for like in like 500 words? So what I did was I organized the research. It was really important to me. One of the highlights or things that came up for me in the research is that there is a lot of shared and parallel experience across the Asian diaspora when in our ancestral homelands, but also when we came to the United States. And so I wanted to capture that for readers so that people come away knowing, we are a very diverse group, but we also have so many shared points that should be things that help us come together in greater solidarity. So when I organized my notes, I tried to make sure that every page captured a wide breadth of that history. And then every page itself is inspired by the history, or refers directly to some points in history for across many of our different groups.
So let's think about, what exciting thing you have to read the book for sure, but what thing was the most surprising in your historical research of Asian
Yeah.
Americans?
I think one of the most big surprises, like I knew that our people have been oppressed, that there's been great injustice. What I
Yes.
didn't know is that like across the board, Asians have always stood up and spoken out, have fought back and just against injustice, have really tried to fight for our own rights and our liberation. And the narratives of Asians in the US is so often that we're quiet, that we're meek, that we're submissive and, and easily erased, which is what has been happened, which is what's happened to us. And so I didn't know that we really have used our power and our voices all the time. These are not narratives or stories that I'd heard before. So many examples, whether we're talking about people who are coming over as enslaved people or enforced indentured servitude, who like mutinied on ships and tried to return home, or people who use the court system, or people who worked in solidarity, as laborers to fight for their rights and for higher wages or for better living conditions. There are so many examples of stories like this that I just never knew.
No, you definitely, and you found out about them, but it's interesting to talk about that, to know people that stand up for their rights, because again, rights are, we hear more in the civil rights movement and different things, but we don't hear about Asian Americans and
Yeah.
certain types of things in the process. And what types of discriminations do you feel happened to Asian Americans? We know all about, during World War II for sure, but what other ones did you spot?
Oh, I mean, there's so many, like whether it's immigration, whether it's like going and the things that haven't happened in our homelands where, with so much colonization, people taking resources, forcing people, changing lives and forcing, systems such that like people were forced to leave to look for better lives elsewhere. Here, like lots of anti-Asian immigration laws. There were a lot of mob violence, like the largest mass lynching in United States history. It was in Chinese communities where Asian people were murdered, en masse. There are lots of examples of labor laws that were really unfair, of redlining, where Asian people were not allowed to go to school or to live in communities where there were white people. I mean, you could go on and on and on about all of these different types of discriminations and like unjust laws that have been and continue to be fought against.
And you wouldn't think that. You wouldn't think
Yeah,
that because it's not in the history books, and you wouldn't think
right.
that because of all, from the civil rights movement to everything that Asian Americans were involved in this. And this is where it's just not even depicted in movies and
Right.
stuff as well.
That's right.
How do you hope through this book and through this, your success as an author, that you can finally start to see a breakthrough in films and things like that
Yeah.
with Asian
I
Americans depicted more in
I think
these
that
things?
I think for me, I am very conscious that I'm just one of so many people who have been working for not just representation, but again, as I said before, greater power and voice. And so my hope is a book like this for We Who Produce Pearls, that it will be read not just by young people, but by people of all ages, because I think it's a book that can speak to everyone and be a starting point for learning some of this history in a way that feels accessible and empowering for all people. And so my hope is like as we understand this shared history, we really find points of connection and ability to work and feel greater solidarity in group, but also across all groups, because so much of this is shared history. So much of this, all of it is all of our history. And when we understand how connected we are, I think that's when we can work, more powerfully for change. So my hope is, books like this and the other books that I write in combination with so many other people doing work in film, in media, in news will continue to shift this narrative towards greater inclusion and solidarity.
All right. Well, thanks again. Appreciate it. Best place
Yeah.
we can go. It's available. When is the book available?
Oh, it's available. It's been available since April. So anywhere books are sold.
All right, fantastic. And especially go to your independent bookstores for it, right?
Yes,
All
I
right,
totally
thanks.
agree.
All right,
Thank you.
thanks again. Appreciate it. You're listening and watching The Neil Haley Show, and we'll be back in just a moment.